Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for Mrs. Blue Reads, and we're reading Tumtum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. We're, I believe, on the last 3 chapters of The Great Escape. If you remember correctly, General Marshmouse has been locked up with the other gerbils in the school's candy cupboard. So they have things to eat, but they need a way to get out. The ballerinas weren't able to get to them because they had been moved. And this is the last 3 chapters. Will they escape? This book is by Emily Bearn, pictures are by Nick Price, and published by Little Brown and Company. All right, you ready? Chapter 13, The Great Escape. There was a great whoop of joy from the gerbils when they read the words on the boxes. They'd been locked away with a lifetime supply of lemon drops, candy bars, lollipops, and potato chips. Even the general managed to cheer when he saw the enormous carton of chocolates. The Nutmouses spent a frantic few minutes nibbling through all the cardboard packaging and distributing the food. Tum-Tum pulled out a bar of hazelnut chocolate and passed chunks into the cage. Then he wrestled the cap off a tube of Smarties and showered them down on the prisoners. Nutmeg handed them chips and gumdrops and long strands of strawberry licorice. The ballerinas were looking longingly at a box of jelly beans, for it had seemed an eternity since breakfast. But Miss Tiptoe did not approve of sweets and promptly shooed them all back down the ladder. When the prisoners had been given all they could eat, the Nutmouses scurried down after the others. Then the mice lay in wait on the other side of the corridor, beneath a long row of lockers. A few moments later, a bright light came on, and they felt the earth quake as the children charged into the building. The ballerinas huddled together, watching the huge feet thundering by. One of the children stopped just in front of them to hang up her coat, and the tips of her shoes poked under the locker, brushing Horseradish's tutu. Then suddenly, a bell clanged, and the children disappeared into their classrooms. After that, the mice had a long, anxious wait for the janitor to appear. The hideaway was cramped and dusty, and had it not been for their picnic, they would have felt very glum. Arthur was having an uneasy time, too. The moment he had walked into room 2B, he noticed the empty table where the cage had been, and felt a sense of foreboding. "Where have the gerbils gone?" he asked Miss Short, who was sitting at her desk eating a jelly sandwich. "I will explain to you when you are all sitting down," she replied annoyingly. It seemed a very long wait until everyone had settled, and Miss Short had gone through the attendance sheet. "Now, children," she said eventually, speaking with forced cheerfulness, "some of you may have noticed that our large family of gerbils is no longer with us." "Where have they gone?" they all cried. "They have been removed," Miss Short replied. She spoke as though referring to something distasteful, like a rotten egg. "And I will tell you why," she continued, raising her voice as the children bombarded her with more questions. "Last night, I learned that our gerbils were not the timid creatures we assumed them to be. One of them bit me." Miss Short paused a moment while this information sank in. To force the point, she raised the first finger of her left hand to show off a small bandage. "How come?" Arthur asked suspiciously, for he knew that Miss Short never went near the cage. "It bit me when I tried to give it something nice to eat," Miss Short lied. "And when I discovered how dangerous little creatures were, I knew I must remove them at once, for we wouldn't want any of you being injured, now would we? I didn't dare put the cage in my car, so the janitor kindly agreed to deliver the animals to the pet shop for me." "Has he taken them already?" Arthur asked anxiously. "I sincerely hope so," Miss Short said. "I have told him that I do not wish to see them inside this school building ever again." The children were shocked by this development, and they felt that the story didn't quite add up. But when they pressed Miss Short for more information, she got very angry and told them that she never wanted to hear any mention of the beastly gerbils again. Arthur was so upset he couldn't concentrate on any of his lessons. Then at break time, he rushed to find Lucy on the playground to tell her what had happened. "So she hopes the janitor's already taken them, but she didn't say he definitely had," he explained. The children sat down together on the bench beside the basketball court, feeling wretched. They wished they had never brought their mouse to school. "We could go to the town, find the pet shop, and buy him back," Arthur suggested. But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't work, for the town was 10 miles away, and their father had no car to take them there. besides which they had only 88 pence between them, and a mouse would surely cost more than that. They felt so downcast that it was almost a relief when the bell rang to mark the end of break. But as they were making their way back inside, they saw the janitor walking toward them. He had come from the direction of the shed in the corner of the playground, where he kept all his things. He was carrying a brown sack. "That's the gerbil's food," Arthur said in surprise. "I've seen him with it before. Come on, let's follow him and see where he goes." There we go. There he is with the bag of food. The children waited until he had gone inside, then crept after him down the corridor, but halfway along it he disappeared into the boiler room. "Surely he can't be feeding the gerbils in there," Lucy said, thinking it a very odd place to hide them. They waited outside, pretending to be looking for something in one of the lockers. They should have been back in their classrooms by now, but they had to see what happened. Presently the janitor reappeared, still carrying the brown sack. The children watched, motionless, as he walked on down the corridor, then stopped outside the candy cupboard. He stood there a moment, glancing left and right. He looked nervous, as if he didn't want anyone to see what he was doing. Then he removed the keys from his belt and opened the cupboard door. As he did so, the Nutmouses and Miss Tiptoe hovered at the rim of the locker, watching his every move. The ballerinas were lined up behind them, mounted on their pogo sticks, poised to advance the moment the general gave the order. "On your mark, girls," they heard him bellow from inside the cage. "Get set, charge!" But just as the order was given, Nutmeg issued a counter command. "Stop, stop!" she shrieked, pointing down the corridor. "Tum-Tum, look! It's Arthur and Lucy. We can't let them see us." "Hold back, girls!" Tum-Tum shouted. The janitors fumbled a hand inside the cupboard trying to find the light switch. You could hear lots of rattling and squealing as General Marchmouse roared commands and shook the bars in the most dreadful rage. "Charge! Charge!" the general cried, but Tum-Tum was still holding the ballerinas back. "How dare you disobey my orders?" the general shouted. At that moment, there was a sudden clack of high heels, and Miss Short appeared. As she walked past the candy cupboard, the janitor looked over his shoulder shiftily, but she took no notice of him. "Arthur, Lucy, what are you doing here?" she asked crossly. "Break ended 5 minutes ago." The children at once hurried off to their classrooms, and then Miss Short disappeared into the staff room. Finally, the coast was clear. "Charge!" the general shouted again, and this time the mice did. Chapter 14. The janitor was still fumbling for the light switch when the ballerinas sprang from beneath the locker and began bouncing toward him. They moved in perfect unison and made not the slightest sound. It was like a silent ballet, with Miss Tiptoe conducting unseen from the rear. The general was issuing commands through the bars. "Go! Ambush him now!" "Stop squeaking!" the janitor muttered, finally finding the switch. As he turned on the light, the ballerinas all bounced straight for him on their pogo sticks, soaring like a flock of birds toward the huge keyring in his left hand. The Nutmouses and Miss Tiptoe shook with fear, but the dancers were much too agile for the janitor. As they rose into the air, they raised their left paws from their pogo sticks and grabbed at the keys as they sailed by, jerking them from his hand. The whole bunch crashed to the floor with the ballerinas dropping down silently behind. Before the janitor had time to look down, the ballerinas had dragged the keyring under the shelf at the back of the cupboard. The Nutmouses were waiting. "This one," Tum-Tum cried, finding a small red key. "Didn't the gerbil say it was a green key, dear?" Nutmeg asked anxiously. No, they said it was red," Tum-Tum replied. He wrestled furiously to unlock it, sweat pouring down his nose. "Oh, hurry, Tum-Tum, hurry!" Nutmeg squawked as the janitor got down on his hands and knees, searching in bewilderment for his keys. He still had no idea what hit him. Finally, the red key fell free. "Quick, divert him!" Tum-Tum shouted to the ballerinas. Each one of them had a long lace looped around her waist, borrowed from the shoes left in the lockers opposite. Tying one end to the keyring and attaching the other to their pogo sticks, they all bounced out of the cupboard and made off down the corridor, with the keys clanking and clattering behind them. The janitor looked on in astonishment as the ballerinas bounced higher and higher and faster and faster. He thought he must be seeing things, and yet there they were, as clear as day, 13 bouncing mice dressed in beige tutus. By the time he had gathered his wits and chased after them, they had bounced nearly as far as the gymnasium. Meanwhile, the gerbils lowered the ladder, and Tum-Tum and Nutmeg scrambled up with the red key. "Hurry up there," the general said. "What's the devil taken you so long? Come on, come on." The key was nearly as long as he was, and as Tum-Tum pushed it into the padlock, his paws were shaking. He was normally such a calm mouse, but all the excitement had unnerved him. Nutmeg placed her paws on his to steady him, and together they tried to turn it in the lock. But though they wriggled it and jiggled it, it wouldn't budge. "Oh, do move along," the general bullied, rattling the bars in frustration. There's the janitor chasing the ballerinas on pogo sticks. The gerbils were crowded behind him, desperate to get out, but there was nothing the Nutmouses could do. "We've got the wrong key," Nutmeg said in despair. The general turned green. He could hear the other keys clattering farther and farther away down the corridor, and with them his only hope of freedom. "Get them back," he shouted. Tumtum skedaddled down the ladder and ran recklessly after the ballerinas. "Come back," he cried, and hearing them, they all obediently turned and raced back down the corridor, pulling the keys behind them. The girls were at Tumtum's side in seconds. He quickly found the green key and tried to unhook it, but it was wedged tight, and he couldn't pry it off the ring. He could hear the janitor thundering back up the corridor. He would be upon them in seconds. "Quick, tie the whole bunch to the ladder, and we'll pull them up," shouted the general, monitoring events from the cage, trembling. Tumtum tied the keys to the end of the straw ladder with one of his shoelaces. Then the prisoners hoisted them up to the shelf, and Miss Tiptoe and Nutmeg dragged them to the cage. "This one," Nutmeg cried, finding the green key. She and Miss Tiptoe seized hold of it and heaved it up into the lock. Then they wrenched it clockwise, and finally the padlock gave way. But at that moment, a shadow fell over the cage, and to their horror, the animal saw the janitor peering in at them. He shot out a hand to snap the padlock shut, but the prisoners moved too fast for him. "Charge!" the general cried, and before the janitor could secure the lock, they all stampeded the door together, a dozen gerbils and their commanding officer bursting free with a great victorious squeal. They leaped straight onto the janitor and started scrambling along the arms of his sweater, then cascading down the leg of his pants. He swatted at them wildly, but they clung on tight. On reaching the floor, they spread into the corridor, hurtling all over the place. "Scatter!" the general shouted. "Run for your lives!" The plan had been to retreat to the air vent, but in his excitement, the general had forgotten where it was. Chaos ensued as ballerinas and gerbils flew about the floor, with the janitor trying to stamp on them with his enormous boots. The gerbils moved like tornadoes, amazed at how fast their legs could carry them after their long months in captivity. But the general was so full of chocolate that he was less nimble. "Give me a pogo stick," he panted, but there were none to spare. Tumtum and Nutmeg and Miss Tiptoe crouched under a locker, looking on in dismay. They had promised the general that they would follow his orders, but they couldn't understand what he was up to. The operation had descended into chaos. "Why doesn't he beat a retreat through the air vent?" Tumtum asked hopelessly. "This goes on much longer. Someone's going to get trodden on." Miss Tiptoe decided to take charge. "He is not fit to lead," she said sharply, marching out into the corridor. Girls, gerbils, this way, please," she cried, pointing under the locker with her walking stick. "Follow me through the vent." The girls at once obeyed and bounced straight toward her. But the gerbils dithered, their loyalties torn. For a while they thought the general rather ridiculous. He was an officer after all, and he was still telling them to scatter. But then they saw the janitor's boot looming over them, and without dithering a moment longer, they all bolted for cover. At that moment, Miss Short reappeared. "They've multiplied!" she shrieked, seeing the animals fleeing under the locker. And then all the classroom doors opened at once as teachers and children poured into the corridor, wondering what the commotion was about. "You've let them out!" Miss Short raged at the janitor. "The whole school will be infested. And yet, even as she spoke, the animals were all escaping through the vent, or at least all but General Marchmouse, for he was so busy shouting commands that he didn't notice the others leaving. "It's my mouse!" Arthur cried delightedly, seeing the general rushing back and forth in his underpants. Miss Short let out another shriek as he darted over her shoe. "Scatter!" the general cried again, wondering where the others had gone. "Here, General, follow us," shouted Tumtum as he helped Nutmeg wriggle out through the vent. "How dare you leave the battlefield without my permission?" the general retorted. But then he looked up and noticed for the first time the huge pairs of feet, dozens of them, all crowded around him, and suddenly he didn't feel quite so brave. "Wait for me!" he whimpered and ran at full speed after the others. The children all cheered, delighted that their gerbils had escaped being sent to the pet shop. But Miss Short was furious. There he is. There's the general with all the feet around him. You may think it's funny now, but just you wait until they multiply, she snarled. They've doubled overnight. I saw at least 2 dozen of them, and by tomorrow there'll be 4 dozen, and by Monday there'll be 16 dozen, and in a few weeks' time there'll be thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and they'll be everywhere. You'll find gerbils writhing in your shoes and burrowing in your pencil cases and nesting in your coat pockets. They'll take over your desks and your bags, and when they die, you'll find their corpse rotting in your food. The children looked alarmed. For much as they liked their gerbils, the thought of thousands and thousands and thousands of them was rather unsettling. And the school food was disgusting enough already, without dead gerbils flavoring it. For a moment, they were all silenced. But then Lucy noticed something going on outside. It looked as if there were lots of rubber balls bouncing across the playground. She turned and pressed her face to the window pane. "It's the gerbils," she said in astonishment. "They're bouncing." In fact, it was the ballerinas who were bouncing. The gerbils were running by their side, but they were already too far away for Lucy to tell the difference. The children crowded around the window to look. "They're on pogo sticks," one of them said. "Don't be ridiculous," Miss Short snapped. "Gerbils do not use pogo sticks." But the children sensed that this was not her area of expertise, and from that day on, the story of the fantastic bouncing gerbils was to become quite a legend in the village school. Chapter 15, the final chapter of The Great Escape. The animals ran and bounced across the playground as fast as they could, fearing that the janitor and Miss Short might come chasing after them. It was only when they were outside the school gates that they dared to look around. But the playground was empty, and there was no one coming. "We've made it," Tumtum cried. And then all the gerbils started clapping and whooping, for it isn't every day that a gerbil escapes. The ballerinas whooped too, but it was the general who seemed the most excited of all. "We're free!" he shouted, punching the air in triumph. "The enemy has been fooled. Oh, what a brilliant campaign. When the Royal Mouse Army hears about this, I shall receive another medal." "I say 3 cheers for Miss Tiptoe and her dancers," Tumtum said chivalrously, but the general appeared not to hear. Seeing as the mood was so festive, Nutmeg decided to invite everyone back to Nutmouse Hall. "We shall have a celebratory feast," she announced eagerly. And they all thought this was a very good idea, especially the gerbils, for now that they had left the cage, they had no home to go to. So Tumtum led the party back toward Rose Cottage. It was a slow journey, for everyone was rushing around in different directions, and Miss Tiptoe kept stopping to make sure that none of her dancers had been left behind. By the time they crawled in under the garden door, it was nearly mid-afternoon. There was no one around, so Tumtum led the party straight across the kitchen floor and under the dresser. Then he held open the gates while they all trooped into the broom cupboard. There they are, all going into the broom cupboard. When they set their eyes on Nutmouse Hall, the gerbils suddenly fell quiet. It was like a fairy tale house, grander than anything they had ever seen. The sight of so many turrets and windows overwhelmed them. When Tumtum showed them inside, they were even more astonished, for the gerbils had lived all their lives in one room, and the cage hadn't been much of a room at that. But the Nutmouses had dozens of rooms, all stuffed with treasures. Wherever one looked, there were chandeliers, tapestries, pretty vases, silver candlesticks, and gilt mirrors. There was even a grand piano. It was all so splendid that the gerbils, who were still naked, felt a little out of place. But Nutmeg had an idea as to how to make them feel more at home. "I'm afraid this house is rather chilly," she said tactfully, blowing on her paws. "I think I should find you all something to wear." "Something to wear?" they asked nervously. The gerbils had never worn anything except the fur coats they had been born in. The idea of clothes struck them as very strange. But Nutmeg gave them no chance to protest and promptly shooed them all upstairs for a fitting. She showed the lady gerbils into her bedroom and supplied them with pretty frocks and smart cashmere shawls. Then she took the male gerbils into Tumtum's dressing room and found them each a fine tweed suit. Once they were dressed in the Nutmouse's expensive country clothes, the gerbils began to feel more sure of themselves. "Hooray! You look much more civilized," the general said approvingly as they strutted back into the living room. He barely recognized them from the scruffy little creatures he had shared a cage with. And the gerbils barely recognized the general, for he had not only got dressed, but had brushed his tail, blackened his eyebrows, and oiled his whiskers. When he was staying in a smart house, he always liked to look his best. The gerbils and the general had a delightful time admiring each other in the living room, and meanwhile Nutmeg set about wrestling up a celebratory feast from the odds and ends in her pantry. She made a salmon mousse, a saffron risotto, a fish pie, a hash, a cockroach roulade, a trifle, a chocolate mousse, and a sponge pudding with a jug of hot molasses sauce to pour on top. By the time she'd finished, it was getting dark, so she served the meal by candlelight in the banqueting room, and she laid the table with all her best silver and crockery and damask table napkins. This was a little confusing for the gerbils, who until now had always eaten from the trough. But the ballerina showed them what to do and explained how knives were for cutting with, and forks for spearing with, and spoons for spooning with. And the gerbils picked it up so quickly that before long, one could hardly tell them from the mice. Many courses later, as Nutmeg was serving coffee and mince, Tumtum tapped his glass with a fork, signaling for quiet. Then he stood up heavily and made an announcement. "Until you find somewhere to live, you must all stay here with us," he said to the gerbils, who were seated in a long line down one side of the table. "We've plenty to eat and drink, and we've 16 spare bedrooms, 9 spare bathrooms, a ballroom, a library, and a schoolroom." The gerbils raised their glasses and cheered. They were getting so used to all this fine living that their days in captivity already seemed a distant memory. And there they are, all at the table. By now, everyone was in such high spirits that no one wanted the party to stop. So after dinner, the gerbils and the ballerinas danced together in the ballroom, and it was long after midnight when Miss Tiptoe finally took her charges back to school. Once the general and the gerbils had gone to bed, Nutmeg and Tumtum made themselves a thermos of cocoa and went to sit in the library. They were unused to entertaining on this scale, and they were both worn out. "Do you suppose the gerbils will ever move out?" Nutmeg asked, collapsing on the sofa. She had become very fond of them, but there was a part of her that longed for some peace and quiet again. "I'm sure we can help them find a proper home of their own," Tumtum replied reassuringly. "Rose Cottage is much too small and crowded. There's not an inch of space left to build in, but there are plenty of nooks and crannies at the manor house that they could move into. I remember the general telling me about an airing cupboard that the present owners never used. He and Mrs. Marchmouse had been going to make their home in it, but they decided it was too big, so they took over the gun cupboard instead. It might be just right for the gerbils." "Oh, Tumtum, what a wonderful idea," Nutmeg said happily. "I'll go up to the attic tonight and write the children a letter telling them that all the escaped pets are moving into a new home just down the lane." Once this problem was solved, the Nutmouses sat silently for a while, watching the fire flicker. They both felt very relieved that all the dramas had come to an end. "We're such humdrum mice, Tumtum," Nutmeg said eventually. "It does seem unfair that we should have been dragged into another adventure quite so soon. I hope we don't have any more." "Of course we won't, dear," Tumtum replied confidently. "Life will be a lot quieter once the general's safely back in his gun cupboard." And Nutmeg hoped very much that Tumtum was right. No, do you think Tumtum is right? The name of the next book in Tumtum and Nutmeg Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall is called The Pirate's Treasure. If you think we should read The Pirate's Treasure, you can send me a message. You can comment on the video when it's posted. If you think it's time to read something else, you can also do that as well. We could start a brand new book, or we could continue the adventures of Tumtum and Nutmeg. If you haven't signed up yet for summer reading through Read Squeeze, please do consider doing it. I do have to let you know that for the Read and Bead, unfortunately, the colored cords that I picked up, the letter beads that I bought do not fit. You're still welcome to earn letter beads if that's what you would like to do. Maybe you have something at home that you can put the letter beads on. The color beads will fit, but the little chain that's on the cord will have to be removed first for the beads to be put on, and then it could be put back on if you need for length. If you have any question about Read Squared, our online summer reading program, please send me an email or give me a call, and I'll try to help you best I could. There's lots of fun on there. There's missions like scavenger hunts and all kinds of things, reading outside, going on hikes, lots of things, as well as reading books, and you earn points and badges online, and you also earn the beads and things. And we have summer reading for all ages, babies and toddlers, preschoolers, kids that are going to be in the elementary school next year. Kids, we have summer reading for teens. It's differently. They don't do the read and be, neither do the babies and toddlers or the adults. And we have an adult program. So there's something for everyone. And I think that you'll really enjoy it if you just check it out. Whipafreelibrary.readsquared.com. Goodness. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon. There's supposed to be some good weather. I know it's going to be hot. It's my favorite time of year. I know some people don't enjoy the heat. I do. I hope you enjoy the good weather and have a wonderful rest of your week. And I miss you lots. Bye.